In Ian Bogost's article, Video Games Are Better Without Stories, he argues that video games are narratively weaker than other forms of media, by giving examples of what are believed to be narratively strong video games and breaking down how they deliver said narrative. To be quite frank, I heavily disagree with this argument. From a storytelling perspective, putting a viewer into the role of a participant rather than restricting them to just an observer can lead to some of the most engaging and emotionally impactful narratives of our time. And no medium creates this role better than video games. Hanging over his primary argument is this fantasy of the Star Trek holodeck, saying, a long-standing dream. Video games will evolve into interactive stories, like the ones that play out fictionally on the Star Trek holodeck. In an ideal future, video games would evolve into this machine that could create environments where a participant could directly interact with the environment and the characters around them, having their own impact on the narrative being told. Let's say, for example, you want to be a detective. Just boot up the noir simulation, and you would be able to pick up clues and talk to suspects as if it was real life. Compare that holodeck fantasy to even today's most advanced VR simulations, and it still seems like we're far away from that ideal. We still need to work on that smart AI or that advanced physics engine in order to truly make an immersible environment that we think is reality. To circumvent these narrative simulations, many games would resort to what Bogost calls environmental storytelling. Bogost summarizes environmental storytelling by clarifying environmental stories invite players to discover and reconstruct a fixed story from the environment itself. The players then able to take these bits of the story and put them together to interpret the overall narrative. In BioShock, they use recordings and radio calls.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence.
While games like What Remains of Edith Finch use straight-up narration.
I lived here until I was 11, but I wasn't allowed inside half the rooms.
Creating a complex narrative web of decisions branching out to other decisions takes a lot of time to execute well. The Telltale games pride themselves on player agency and are the very few in the industry to have stories where your choices do matter. Bogost elaborates further on the player's role in an environmental story by saying, instead of trying to resolve the matter of simulated characters and plot, the genre gives up on both, embracing scripted action instead. The player's experience becomes that of a detective, piecing together narrative coherence from fragments convincingly left behind in the game's physical environment. Environmental storytelling, while a clever tool on part of the developer and the writer, will primarily be the product of a very linear story. BioShock, Edith Finch, and many other games all have linear stories, with the only variation maybe being a good ending or a bad ending based off some minor decisions you make. Bogost believes that since the player has no real agency on the plot of the game, that it could be reduced to a book or a film, and in his words, the best interactive stories are still worse than even middling books and films. So, what's the point? Most of the visually impressive elements of games and clever game mechanics could be emulated using CG and animation, and the stories that they tell are linear enough to merit the creation of a movie or a book. I would argue that by reducing a video game's narrative to the overarching story, Bogost ignores some of the incredible narrative elements that video games bring to the table. What other medium allows someone to immerse themselves in a fiction where they can interact with the environment around them, albeit to a limited degree? To illustrate my point more clearly, I want to look at two different games that I believe have strong and emotionally impactful stories to tell. Oddly enough, both games offer little in the ways of player agency. However, it's how they are able to complement their narratives using clever game design that allows a player to immerse themselves in these environments, starting with Valve's Portal series. In these games, you take control of Chell, a mute test subject with a gun that can create a two-way portal. She is trapped in a facility under the scornful gaze of a nigh omnipotent AI named GLaDOS. Your role as a test subject is to complete testing chambers. Like most games, Portal has a very linear story, where the player can do nothing to change its plot. However, the game wears this quality almost like a badge of honor by having GLaDOS insult the player, tearing them down to try and extinguish any hope of escape.
Please note that we have added a consequence for failure. Any contact with the chamber floor will result in an unsatisfactory mark on your official testing record, followed by death. Good luck. Fantastic. You remained resolute and resourceful in an atmosphere of extreme pessimism. I'm going to kill you, and all the cake is gone.
As a player, I found her quotes hilarious. However, with every insult, I found myself growing more defiant. I was driven to complete every test chamber to the best of my capabilities in a sort of act of rebellion, like I had something to prove. As the game progressed, I built confidence in my capabilities, and this mixed with my continuously growing defiance led me to discover cracks in her armor. Each of them their own little stories in and of themselves, of tales of those before me. Some of them gave me hope, and some of them filled me with dread. I was growing more and more independent until GLaDOS saw me as a real threat and decided to let me go.
Congratulations. The test is now over. All Aperture technologies remain safely operational up to 4,000 degrees Kelvin. Rest assured that there is absolutely no chance of a dangerous equipment malfunction prior to your victory incandescence. Thank you for participating in this Aperture Science computer-aided enrichment activity. Goodbye.
In the moment GLaDOS decides to throw the player in an incinerator, they've already found a way to act against her will, and in a brief moment experience a mix of refreshing freedom and sweet revenge, as you have outsmarted her. You made that decision, and you were able to escape.
What are you doing? Stop it.
Before I continue with my next example, I want to ask, have you ever read a book or watched a movie that made you feel like you made a mistake? Like the consequences of your actions affected more than just yourself? Besides watching The Green Lantern with your family, it's hard to really come up with a good example. With books and movies, you have to make a great effort to put yourself in the shoes of some fictional character, and if you can't do that, you're just screaming at a fake person and telling them that there is another way, when in reality, they may not have another choice. Lisa, the Painful RPG, is a role-playing game, and as such allows the player to fill the role of a fictional character. And this, oddly enough, is another game where, in the grand scheme of things, your decisions don't really matter. After a nuclear blast renders the world into a Mad Max wasteland and mysteriously eliminates all women off the face of the earth, you take the role of a martial artist turned drug addict named Brad. He is left in this weird and dangerous world filled of roaming marauders, idiots, and disturbing mutants. After wandering the wastes, he happens upon a child who just so happens to be a girl, and decides to name her Buddy and raise her with a group of his childhood friends acting as her family. We get to see how Buddy positively impacts Brad and how he makes an effort to put his past behind him before Buddy is suddenly taken away from him. In the beginning, everything is laid out simply. They stole your daughter, and now you must rescue her. However, over time, things get more and more complicated. It's not just about you now. The people who kidnapped your daughter want to try and use her to save the world. The people Brad has come to trust turn against him, and his chaotic quest to be the knight in shining armor puts everyone around him in danger. Brad has to make some really disturbing decisions. Does he give all his food and weapons, or sacrifice his arm? Does he kill all the people willing to help him, or watch his daughter get mutilated by some freak? Of course, none of it matters to anyone but you. If you lose your arm, you can't do certain combat techniques, and if you lose your party, you can't save your daughter. But will you stand idle while she gets hurt? These are decisions Brad makes to hopefully save her in the end. However, by the end of the game, Brad is stripped of his humanity, his sanity, his limbs, and the people he loves. By the end of it all, Brad and I asked ourselves if we made the right decision. The answer is no. Even though
As
we
an
were able
observer,
to save our
I would have
daughter,
never been
we
able
both
to feel
felt
these
like
sorts of
monsters.
emotions.
Video games are a new and exciting medium for storytelling that can invoke powerful emotions through personal and tangible experiences that the player is able to create themselves. Books and movies could never hope to emulate that sort of experience, even if they told the same story, word for word. As one last example, there's a short indie game called Perfect Vermin. I encourage you to play it beforehand. It's free on Steam. And in this game, you take control of an exterminator, killing vermin, of course. Over the course of the game, your employer grows more grotesque and tumorous, and the number of vermin multiply by each level. By the end of the game, we learn that this man has late-stage cancer and is fighting for his life. We play as a white blood cell, trying to destroy it, but damage the surrounding tissue as a result. This story actually caused someone to make the first steps to quit smoking, so I ask you, do you think Quentin Tarantino could have done it better?